For about 3 weeks, the two armies continued marching, one behind the other, neither good friends nor yet open enemies. The mutual distrust resulted in constant quarrels, and, if the soldiers from both armies were cutting wood in the same forest or gathering grass from the same fields, there was sure to be a fight. Clearchus did not, however, believe that the Persians had any deliberate intention of breaking the treaty to which they had sworn, and, in the hope of putting an end to a state of affairs which was every day getting worse, he resolved if possible to come to an understanding with Tissaphernes. He sent word, therefore, that he wished to speak with him. Tissaphernes accordingly invited him to a conference in his tent, and Clearchus spoke as follows. "You regard us," he said, "as enemies, and consequently we think it necessary to stand on our guard against you. These mutual suspicions may easily lead to actual war, and therefore I am anxious to convince you that you have no reason to doubt us. First, and before all things, we are prevented by our oath from thinking of you in any other light than that of friends. He who breaks an oath plunges himself into the greatest misery, for who is swift enough to outrun the wrath of the gods? In what darkness could he hide himself from them? What fortress would protect him, were it ever so strong? For to the gods all things are subject, and they have power over all, everywhere alike. But more than this, you are of all others the man who is best able to help us. Without you, our way is shrouded in shades of night, for we know not your land. The inhabited districts we should fear to enter, but far more should we dread the barren wastelands, where there would be none to help us. But with your goodwill every way is open to us, every river can be crossed, we shall be among friends, and food will not fail. If we were mad enough to think of taking your life, we should be destroying our best friend and should expose ourselves to the fury of the great king who would hasten to avenge your death. And now I will tell you what services we can render in return for your friendship. We know that you are harassed by the Mysians, the Pisidians, and other nations, and, moreover, that the Egyptians have risen against you, but, if we Hellenes are your friends and fight as comrades by your side, what people can hope to withstand you? Taking all things into consideration, it seems incredible that you should suspect us, and I can only suppose that some mischief-maker has been at work, causing you to question our good faith." In his own mind, Clearchus had little doubt that the mischief-maker was Menon, one of the other generals. Menon was a rival of Clearchus and wished to supersede him as commander-in-chief of the Hellene army, while Clearchus was by no means inclined to make way for him. Clearchus suspected that Menon had been trying to induce the satrap to insist upon his being given the first place, and that, in return for this, he had promised to bring over the Hellenes to the party of Tissaphernes. Of such a plan the selfish Menon was certainly capable, and it afterward appeared that he was not entirely innocent of intrigues with the Persians. But it is very possible that Clearchus may have been misled by jealousy into overestimating the extent of his guilt. To the speech of Clearchus, Tissaphernes made a hypocritical reply. "I rejoice," he said, "to hear that you know how to value our friendship. But now, on the other hand, have we not long since given you proofs of our sincerity? If we wish to do you an injury, have we not foot soldiers and horsemen enough to overpower you? Is there any lack of favorable places for falling upon you? Could I not seize the mountains to block your way? Or prevent you from crossing a river? Or, surest means of all to compass your ruin, could I not set fire to the country far and wide around you and, having destroyed all the fruits of the earth, leave you to die of hunger? Why have I not done this? Because I love the Hellenes and hope, by means of their friendship, to attain my highest wish. The great king," he added, "is the only one who may wear the tiara upright upon his head, but, with your help, another may wear it upright in his heart." By these mysterious words, he meant to signify that he aspired to fight himself for the throne, as Cyrus had done. He also hinted that Clearchus was quite right in suspecting one of his fellow officers, and asked him to bring all the generals and captains to a meeting in his tent, when he promised to point out the traitor. All difficulties appeared now to have been smoothed away. Tissaphernes assumed a most friendly manner and begged Clearchus to remain with him for supper and be his guest for the night. On the next day, Clearchus returned to the camp and reported the good understanding that he had established with Tissaphernes. But when he said that Tissaphernes wished all the officers to assemble in his tent, the Hellenes objected, for they did not trust the satrap and did not care to let their best men run any risk of falling into his clutches. Clearchus, however, was so confident that all would go well and pressed his opinion with such persistence that, after a long discussion, it was at last decided to send 5 generals and 20 captains to take part in the conference. Clearchus was of course one of the 5 generals, so also was Menon. They were accompanied by 200 soldiers who wished to buy provisions in the barbarian camp, but all were unarmed, for it was to be a friendly meeting. Some hours passed by, and the Hellenes did not return. Those who were left behind began to look out anxiously for their comrades, but they could see nothing but a number of Persian horsemen galloping about separately in all directions upon the heath which lay between the 2 camps. They did not understand what this could mean, but soon the horrible explanation was brought to them by a badly wounded Hellene who made his way back to the camp as fast as he was able and told them what had happened. On reaching the tent of Tissaphernes, the 5 generals had been invited to go within. The captains were left standing at the door. Presently, a blood-red flag was hoisted above the tent, and, at this signal, the barbarians fell upon the captains and the 200 soldiers who were all unarmed and massacred them. Those who attempted to flee were cut down by horsemen sent in pursuit of them and killed upon the heath. Of the fate of the generals who had gone within the tent, the wounded man knew nothing. On hearing this terrible news, the Hellenes rushed to seize their arms, for they naturally expected an immediate attack. This did not, however, take place, but Areus, with some other nobles and about 300 Persian cavalry, rode towards the camp and demanded to speak with one of the generals. When he was within hearing, Areus cried out, "Clearchus was a traitor, he had broken the oath and has been punished. To you I bring an order from the great king to deliver up your arms, for they belong to Cyrus, who was his slave." Everyone in the Persian Empire was considered a slave, except the king himself. But one of the generals answered with spirit befitting the occasion. "Thou miserable Areus," he cried, "and you others who were the friends of Cyrus, you are the most wicked of men, you who formerly swore that our friends should be your friends, and our enemies your enemies, and have now entered into a covenant with the godless Tissaphernes to destroy us." To this the Persians could make no reply, and they turned back to their own camp. The night that followed was a terrible one for the Hellenes. The infamous crime that had been committed could only be regarded as the first of a series planned long ago by Tissaphernes. Now that Clearchus was gone, who was to command the little band of Hellenes, left as sheep without a shepherd? If the treacherous barbarians were bent upon their destruction, what was to hinder them from taking them by surprise again and again, until at last they were reduced to the choice of death or slavery? Throughout the whole camp reigned discouragement, despondency, even despair. Only a few of the soldiers could rouse themselves to take food or kindle a fire. Wherever they chanced to be, they threw themselves down upon the ground and passed a sleepless night, kept awake by brooding care for what the next day might bring forth, and for sick longing for their country, their parents, their wives, their children, whom they feared they should never see again. On entering the tent of Tissaphernes, the 5 generals had been surprised and made prisoners, and were forthwith sent to Susa, there to await the king's pleasure. Menon was set at liberty, but the rest languished for a year in prison and were then beheaded. For Clearchus, who had been the most intimate friend of her dearly loved Cyrus, Parysatis, the queen mother, did everything in her power. Through the medium of her physician, she was able to supply him with many comforts in his prison, and she even hoped that her influence with Artaxerxes would prevail to save his life. But in Statira, the queen consort, she had a rival whose influence was even greater than her own. Statira succeeded in convincing her husband that it was indispensable to the dignity of the Persian throne to pass sentence of death upon the most active and distinguished adherent of the usurper Cyrus, and Clearchus was consequently executed. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law had long been consumed by mutual jealousy and hatred, and this last struggle filled the cup to overflowing. In order to revenge herself for the death of Clearchus, Parysatis bribed a servant to give poison to Statira and thus caused her death. As a punishment for the murder, she was banished for a time from Babylon. For a year, Menon was at liberty and went about as he pleased in Susa, but at the end of that time he also was executed, after having been cruelly tortured. The freedom that he enjoyed at first seems to prove that, as Clearchus suspected, he had really rendered some service to the great king, to the disadvantage of his countrymen. And his subsequent death shows that, cunning as he was not cunning enough to provide against all contingencies. It is very possible that here also the influence of Parysatis may have been at work.